this class we are going to review what St. Augustine says about God. And the first thing is he proves God's existence from eternal truths. He observes nature and it is by observing nature and studying nature that we come up with truths about nature. For instance, let us put it this way, Archimedes' principle. You observe nature, you study nature, and Archimedes came up with this Archimedes principle, which all of you know very well, and well, it is truth, you know, that there is a natural truth. There is natural truth you can know by observing nature and studying nature. Okay, so St. Augustine says, as we proceed this way, we also proceed in the following way. In nature, we see different actions of human beings. And we judge those actions and we have an opinion about them. For instance, we can, we can judge an action more or less just. Okay? And St. Augustine says we do so according to an invariable standard. Invariable standard which helps us to make a judgment. Human actions change. We can say that they are more just, less just, etc. But our standard with which we judge, it's always the same. It stays always the same there. So for St. Augustine, this is a proof of there is an invariable standard which is an eternal truth, an invariable truth. So he says, at the end of the day, if there is a group of invariable truths and these fixed ideas with which we judge, he says all of that sphere of invariable truth must be grounded in truth itself, which is God. After having proved God's existence through eternal truths, St. Augustine proceeds on proving God's existence from creatures. And what's the starting point of this proof of God's existence from creatures? St. Augustine says that the starting point is the dynamic attitude of the soul. So according to him, our soul propels us out somehow to find happiness. We want and we are constantly seeking for happiness. So St. Augustine says it is this dynamic attitude of the soul which leads me out, pushes me out to find happiness there. And what happens is, according to Augustine, is you cannot find happiness in the world. It's not possible. You try, but it doesn't work. He had his own experience, as we have read in the Confessions, but he says that's not possible. What happens is you don't find happiness in the world, but you find in the world things that point out towards God, point upward towards God. And he says, as we get to know the soul through the movements of our organs, you get to know through the organs and their movements, then you get to know the soul. So he says, in the same way, we get to know our souls, we get to know God through the works of this world. So in this world, he says, we see order, we see motion, we see beauty, and it is through those things that we come to know God. God must be there somewhere, and there must be God, because without that God, these things couldn't exist. But there is not only God, but also there is divine conservation. The question is, what about our happiness? Because we were trying to find happiness. We will talk about it just a bit later. There is as well a proof of God's existence from the universal consent. Universal consent. St. Augustine says, once God uses his reason and does something, we, rational creatures, cannot miss that. Because what God does is so amazing and so admirable that we get to know it. And through it, we get to know God. And this is what St. Augustine says that happens to most of people. Most of people accept and admit that there must be a God, because what we observe in the world is amazing. That's the way St. Augustine proves God's existence from the argument of universal consent. Now we are going to say something about the process of St. Augustine towards God. St. Augustine started out checking the doubt. We have our doubts. What if I am deceived into thinking that I exist? What if I am deceived into thinking that I can know, etc.? There is doubt. He fixed the problem, as we saw in previous classes. Then he arrives to certainty. There is certainty about knowledge. So he says we can know. There is certainty about reality. There's a reality there that I can know, I can access to, and I can believe the senses, and I can see what is there. There is reality, and I can get to know it, I can know. And then he ventures out in the world of senses. And he explores reality. Remember the dynamic attitude of the soul who seeks out to find God, happiness and wisdom, etc. And in that world of senses, St. Augustine realizes that there is fallibility in our mind, in our intelligence. There is changeableness. Okay, which speaks us about our limits and our limitations or difficulties in order to knowledge, but it still is possible. And what he realizes is that even though I apprehend truths more clear or less clear, depending on the times, Augustine knows that there is a truth out there, okay, which is immutable. He finds immutable truth. For instance, if I didn't understand Archimedes' principle, it still would be true, okay? So there is truth out there, and not only natural truth, but also eternal and immutable truth, which is more excellent than my intelligence. So Augustine reaches this point. There is immutable truth, which is transcendent, and it doesn't depend on my intelligence. So finally, Augustine takes the step, to have an apprehension of God as the ground, of all truth. And he says God is the ground of all truth. God is, at the end of the day, what supports and sustains that wisdom, that knowledge, that happiness we are going after. Now let us say something about God's attributes according to St. Augustine. And of course, everything that St. Augustine says about God's attributes starts in his observation and study of nature and the world. St. Augustine says that there is unity in creation, so there must be unity in God in an absolute way. There is goodness of creation. There's goodness in creation, so there must be goodness in God. Always in an infinite way, in a different way, because nature is limited, but in God that goodness must be infinite. Unity, goodness, there is order in creation. So in creation we find these principles or truths, So that order in creation speaks about God's wisdom. And something important is the world is other existent. The world is other existent. So God must be self-existent being. And that's something very important, because if God is a self-existent being, then there are consequences from that. From that we can conclude that God is eternal, God is immutable, God is infinite, God is incomprehensible, and God is, at the end of the day, God consists of His own perfection. So in that sense, God is simple. God is His own perfection. God is simple, meaning He is one thing, His own perfection. So these are the things. Precisely because God is self-existent being, He consists of being and being and being and being and being. So He is eternal. He cannot change, immutable. He's immutable. He's infinite. He's incomprehensible. You cannot grasp that exactly, because we are totally the opposite. We are finite, we are changeable, etc. And God is simple because He is His own perfection. And then St. Augustine says that, what's God's essence? These are the attributes, okay? Unity, goodness, wisdom, self-existent being, as a consequence of being and self-existent being, eternal, immutable, infinite, incomprehensible, simple. Okay, and if we were to point out the essence of God, St. Augustine says the God's essence, it would be his wisdom, his knowledge, his power, and his goodness. Wisdom, power, knowledge, and his goodness. That would be the essence of God. And of course in God there is no accidents. So God transcends space, transcends time, and everything. Okay, in his essence, God is wisdom, power, knowledge, and goodness. And other attributes we can point out is unity and this self-existent being, which leads us to understand, to grasp that God is eternal, immutable, infinite, incomprehensible, and simple because he is his own perfection. Before God created everything, he knew the things he was going to create. And all the things he was going to create were in him as ideas. Okay? And then after he created those things as an external reflection of those ideas. But before creation, the ideas of the things and people God was going to create, they remain in God's mind, and they had God as an exemplar. Then, when God created the things, he created them as an external reflection of those divine ideas. This is what St. Augustine calls exemplarism. Exemplarism is all the things and people that God was going to create before creation were in God's mind. They belonged to God's mind, to God's thoughts, etc. But by being there as thoughts, all the things that God was going to create had him as an exemplar. So when God created, he created them as something external to him, but at the same time those things are reflections somehow of God. Okay, so that's an argument that St. Augustine explains. And the important thing here is, before creation, the ideas God had of the things he was going to create cannot be understood as an accident in God. Because God doesn't have accidents. God is only essence. And he's transcendent to everything, etc. So the thing is not to mix up these ideas God had of the creation he was going to perform with the accidents in God, because that's not possible. Okay, so St. Augustine says there is exemplarism. Okay, those ideas were reflecting somehow God's essence, but they are totally different than God's essence. They are not accidents, and once God created them, once God created everything, in everything there is some trace of God, because all the things God has created were at the beginning ideas in God's mind, and those ideas had God himself as an exemplar. So that's the argument of exemplarism.